Čestitke organizatorima na organizaciju ovog stvarno velike međunarodne konferencije, stvarno je napravljeno na visokoj razini. Nadam se da ćete moći to ponoviti i sljedeće godine. Hvala na pozivu. Vrlo mi je drago što sam ovdje, sad već druga godina što sam ovdje prisutan. Organizatori su me zamolili da nešto kažem o tome, o održivosti javnih financija u kontekstu Europske unije. A pošto imam mali problema sa terminologijom na crnogorskom jeziku, ja sam odlučio da imam predavanje na engleskom, a onda će diskusija biti kasnije na crnogorskom jeziku. Today I will talk about this trade-off, or whether there is a trade-off between the public finance sustainability and economic growth. And first of all, I will talk about, first I will say that debt, right, is not a major problem that the EU is facing, right? Though we put a lot of efforts into it. The major problem of the EU that's now EU having is actually very slow growth, okay? And then I will document that later. And then I will talk about these fiscal frameworks that the EU has enacted after we adopted the monetary union since 1999, and I will discuss them in more detail, and then I will also ask myself and also general question at the end, whether this new reformed fiscal framework is fit for purpose, actually, whether we can achieve that, what actually European Union or the Euro area countries were trying to do over the past 2 decades. First of all, so let me show first what is the major problem of the EU. The major problem with the EU is slow economic growth. So in this figure, you can see the productivity pattern of the European Union as compared to the US. And EU was very successful after the Second World War. You can see that European Union almost caught up the US in terms of the productivity, but then something happened in the mid of the 90s. This figure is from the Draghi's report. As you can see here, after the mid of the 90s, we see this trend of decreasing or stagnating productivity growth in the European Union, and this is what they call now is a long stagnation, actually. You wouldn't see it unless you compare it to the other countries. See, here, like 30 years, the productivity growth in EU was kind of stagnating. You can see this. Okay, now it works. So if we compare now this productivity growth of EU with the US and Japan, you would see 2 things. First is, since 1995 until 2022, the United States increased its productivity by 50%, and the Euro area countries were able to increase productivity by only 15%. But the most shocking issue that stems from this graph is the pattern of productivity growth of Japan. As you all know, for the Japan, after the financial crisis in 1991, it got into a long and a very long recession, and we usually call this the lost decade. But there was one lost decade, and now we are already in the 4th lost decade. But when you compare this productivity growth in Japan to the Europe's productivity growth, you would see that actually productivity growth in Japan was much higher in that period. So if we are talking about the Japanese last decades, actually, we should talk about the Europe's last decades, right? And so if we compare that to China, of course, this is very dramatic because China in that period increased productivity by 700%, but we were able to increase it only by 15%. And the true benchmark actually for us now in this competitiveness game should be actually China and not the US, because also the US was very bad at productivity growth in that time. But then, does it work? Why was EU lagging in terms of the productivity growth over that period? There were several explanations for that. And one of the explanations for that was made by Mario Draghi in his competitiveness report from September last year. And what he was saying is that after the financial crisis in Europe, between 2009 and 2019, the collective cyclical adjusted fiscal stance in Eurozone countries was like running permanent on average budget surplus, while in the US, they were running quite significant budget deficit of almost 4%. And if you count together all these deficits, so in nominal terms, right, all these primary deficits in absolute terms would then imply that in the same period of these 10 years, the US has injected like 14 times bigger stimulus into their economy than the euro area countries. That means we compare like 8 trillions of stimulus in the US to less than 600 billion of stimulus in the euro area. And we can see that from these figures. So from these figures, we can see in the left panel, you can see the different response to financial crisis and to the COVID crisis in Europe and US. As you can see here, that both regions, US and the euro area countries, they started from the same level of the government debt to GDP, about 60–70%. But then, after the financial crisis, the US injected much more money into the economy, and its debt to GDP increased by 10 percentage points more than in the European Union. And then similar things happened also during the COVID crisis, right? So US responded to both crises more aggressively. And the result of that, you can see in the right panel, you can see the difference in economic growth. So while US was able to kind of boost the economy and produce a very significant and kind of monotonic economic performance, high and persistent growth, the trend of economic growth in Europe diverged from the US, right? After the financial crisis, and also after the COVID crisis, you can see this economic performance in Europe diverge even further from the US, right? And why did it happen? It's because, so the explanation is that US responded to this both crises much more aggressively than the Europe. And you can also here see this from the next graph, so where I just took the numbers on the response during the financial crisis of the US and the euro area, and you see that United States, they increased their debt to GDP in that period by 27 percentage points, while the European or euro area countries responded only by less than 18%. And similar was true also for the COVID crisis, okay? And then what the difference does it make in terms of the economic growth? You can see from the right panel that after the financial crisis in this period of 2009 to 2012, actually US was able to produce high economic growth of about 4%, while Europe, euro area countries were still mired in the recession, so with a decline of GDP by 1.6%. And also similar thing happened during the COVID crisis, where again US was able to produce high economic growth, while in Europe we didn't recover in that period between 2020 and 2021 yet. Okay, so that means there are crucial differences in the fiscal stance and in the fiscal response to this crisis in the US and in the European Union. Okay. But then, of course, we would say in the US, they, in that period, they made a lot of new debt. So the US debt to GDP is now about 120%, while the figure for the Europe is much lower, about 80%. And then, of course, high debt can be problematic. But let us look at the historical examples. So one example here is the British high public debt. So in the 20th century, basically, UK accumulated a lot of debt during the First World War and also during the Second World War, and the debt to GDP after the Second World War was about 270% of GDP. But then, in only 30 years, UK was able to reduce the debt to less than 50% of GDP. How did they make it? They did not make it by repaying the debt, but they were making it by high economic growth. And this is what I will show you here. So basically, if you look at the face value of the debt and the GDP in that period, and you compare both years, 1946 and 1976, you would see that the government debt in that period increased by 140%, while the GDP increased by 1,200%. Basically, UK economy was able to grow out of debt. And that's what this significant path. So later on also, of course, inflation helped a bit, but the basic explanation here is that if you are able to produce high economic growth, okay, then you can also reduce this ratio of GDP, of debt to GDP. And this path could be very important as a lesson for countries. Okay, so what did we learn so far? So far we learned that actually in Europe we have this huge obsession about debt, right? But this obsession leads actually to a trap of slow growth. And then the second lesson is that the debt can be paid off by economic growth. But I don't think actually we in Europe we learned that lesson. And this might be also due to historical reasons. You know, in Germany they are obsessed with debt because of their hyperinflation in the early 1920s. But actually there is no empirical confirmation in economics that would show that inflation actually stems from high debt. But nevertheless, the Germans, they are obsessed with debt, and that's why also European Union and the Euro area countries are obsessed with that. While on the other side, in the US, you know, their historical experience is with the Great Depression, where actually they witnessed a very large increase in unemployment. Unemployment increased to about 27%, and this was a kind of true nightmare for the US, and that's why their central banks of European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve, they had very different objectives regarding the monetary policy. In the EU, so the European Central Banks, so the primary objective is the price stability, while the US, the Federal Reserve has dual mandate. And the first objective is the full employment, and the second one is the price stability. This is because of these historical reasons, right? Okay. Let us now talk about these frameworks in financial frameworks. So EU countries agreed back in 1992, you know, to form the monetary union, and because of the German pressure, because Germany feared that, you know, some countries would run irresponsible fiscal policies, under German pressure, the fiscal framework was created that was called at the time Stability and Growth Pact from 1998. That kind of so the goal was actually to keep the public deficit low, and also to prevent countries from increasing their debt to GDP over 60% of the GDP. But then, of course, the first two countries that violated that were Germany and France, and that fiscal framework was then suspended, modified, and suspended again. And then after the financial crisis, a new framework was enacted, which was called the Fiscal Pact. So it was in December 2010, and then it was introduced in 2011. And this pact was then suspended into 2020 after the outbreak of COVID. And then after 2 years, after several consultations by the European Commission, we have now a new fiscal framework, which is, as I will comment later on, it's kind of promising, but still complicated. Okay? But what's the problem of our fiscal frameworks in Europe is the opposite of what Ben Bernanke said about the quantitative easing. You know, Ben Bernanke was the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and he was the guy who was actually starting the quantitative easing, this monetary experiment, right? Experiment with the monetary policy, you know, and he said it doesn't work in theory, but it does work in practice. But we have a different case in Europe, you know. All these fiscal frameworks in Europe, they look nice in theory, right? But then in practice, they didn't work. And I'm also afraid that also this new framework will not work. It's not fit for what it was made. So just a very brief observation about this first framework that we had. So we had a fiscal rule at that time. So this second framework, and we had so each country, it was country specific. So each country had to write this fiscal rule into the constitution. But there were also two common EU rules. One was the structural deficit should not be bigger than 0.5%. of GDP, and there was a 120 rule. So basically, the country should reduce its excess debt over 60% of GDP in 20 years to 60%, right? But of course, this meant that the fiscal policy was very restrictive, and this led to, or this prevented countries from recovering from the financial crisis. And then in 2014, Mario Draghi, as a president of the ECB, he made a big call in the sense that he enacted the monetary easing in European Union, and in that way he created the fiscal space in the Eurozone countries, especially in Italy and Spain. And then the economic growth started to recover, and we had a kind of a revival of growth. But then there was COVID, and this rule, this framework was then suspended. Most of the economists actually were very critical about this framework before 2020, and there was a consensus among the economists that it is pro-cyclical in the sense because all these estimates, it was based on the estimates of the potential GDP and the output gap, which looks very nice in theory, but in practice actually it's a nightmare because it depends on the methodology. Because you estimate the potential GDP either by productivity, the productivity growth function, or even with statistical methods like some kind of Hodrick-Prescott filter and so on, but then it's very problematic. And this estimate change not only in advance, but also when you estimate it using the previous data, this estimate change also for the past period, and then it means that also all the recommendations and the political decisions that are made before, a year before, or the previous year, could be false just because of this let's say, unreliability of these estimations of the output gap. And some economists wrote that actually using this approach was useless or even dangerous to use it for making the fiscal policy. And then also the politicians had a problem with that because most of the finance ministers didn't understand it because it was not non-transparent, it was unintuitive, and they had a difficulty actually how to explain the structural deficit to the general public and so on, and all this output gap and so on. Okay, but the biggest problem with that fiscal framework was that it actually killed economic growth, right? Because countries in euro area were forced to run restrictive fiscal policy, and they could not stimulate the economy. And that's why we are facing this trend of or very slow economic growth in Europe. Okay. So luckily, in one sense, actually the COVID happened, and during this period, then the European Commission suspended that rule, and it started the consultation with the experts how to modify it, how to reform that fiscal framework. And after 2 years of these consultations, it came up with a new proposal of the new EU fiscal framework, which was now called EU Economic Governance Framework, right? The central goal of that framework is so to strengthen public debt sustainability and to promote sustainable and inclusive growth. And the major goals are here actually to simplify the management, so to make it much more simple, then to improve the national ownership of the framework. That means that countries should kind of own this in the sense that they would put their own midterm goals into this framework. Actually, they would be also more keen to implement it. And then, so there was a bigger emphasis to the medium term, and then also because of the more transparent framework, actually, there's also a possibility that this will strengthen the enforcement of this fiscal rule. So the major goal of this fiscal framework is basically to help countries to reduce these high public debt ratios in a more realistic, gradual, and sustainable way.